Bones of the skull, the cranium. The cranial bones are the bones that cover and protect the brain. The first cranial bone is this bone right here in the front or the forehead called the frontal bone. Behind the frontal bone are two parietal bones, one on the left and one on the right. Behind the parietal bone is the occipital bone. On the occipital bone is a landmark that you need to be familiar with. This large opening is called the foramen magnum. The next cranial bone is the bone on the lateral surface of the cranium, called the temporal bone. And on the temporal bone, there are two landmarks that you need to be familiar with. The first one is this opening right here, called the external auditory meatus. The next landmark is a landmark where the lower jawbone, the mandible, meets the temporal bone. So this indentation here is called the mandibular fossa. The last cranial bone is this bone here that actually wraps around, underneath, and to the other side, forming a U-shaped bone. This bone is called the sphenoid. Bones of the skull, the facial bones. The facial bones are the bones that make up the face. The first facial bone is called the zygoma. A landmark on the zygoma that you need to be familiar with is the zygomatic arch. The next bone is the upper jawbone, called the maxilla. The next bone is the lower jawbone, called the mandible. A landmark on the mandible that you need to be familiar with is this piece of bone right here, called the mandibular condyle. The next facial bone is this bone here that's part of the nose, which we call the nasal bone. Within the nasal cavity is a bone that divides the nasal cavity into right and left sections. This bone down the middle is called the vomer.